I'm going to explain how reason could not exist without emotion or contradiction. The two paradoxes of reason run a coach and horses through vast swathes of what is currently considered worthy and respectable. Paradoxes are not self-contained. Strictly nothing is self-contained. Their apparent absurdity says more than they state. For instance, Epimenides Paradox, also known as the liar's paradox, is as follows. The Cretan has said all Cretans are liars. It's an ancient formulation of a liar's paradox, saying, but without stating, I'm a liar. Can you believe me? The paradox establishes the need for trust and some kind of pre-established shared characteristics, like a common physiology of perception, which provides sufficient to appreciate what someone else said. Paradoxes raise questions. I'm going to take you through the two paradoxes of reason and attempt answers to their questions. Some conclusions undermine key assumptions and beliefs held in philosophy and across society for decades, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of years. The first paradox observes reason, like logic, is not a closed system. It may sound a cliché, but, as Da Vinci noted, realize that everything connects to everything else. Logic has to be linked to matters outside of logic to be of any earthly use. The same goes for reason. Reason alone and disconnected would be aimless. Devoid of utility, point, or purpose, reason could not exist. So what drives it? The modern view, and one held for a very long time, is that emotion is the enemy of reason. It's too common to see people getting upset over disagreement, resorting to insult, insinuation, and other fallacies such as specific to general, straw man, irrelevant conclusion, appeal to authority, and so on. And it's odd that the truth or a different opinion should prompt excuses not to listen, and in effect cause distrust to cripple reason and tolerance. The paradox states, without the driving force of emotion, there would be no reason to reason. Emotion is integral to reason, but the process of reasoning forbids the participation of emotion. Reason is not the same as reasoning. The paradox presents a tension between elemental parts of human nature, our emotions, versus the process we use to be able to think and engage with the world. It's common for people to say, I'm a logical person, or emotions must be kept away from rational discussion. By the first paradox, they are right, and yet so wretchedly wrong. Cold-blooded World War I generals, sending sometimes even friends or relations over the top, marching boldly through a blizzard of heavy machine gun fire, appeared psychopathic. But behind those words and thoughts, their emotion was as great as anyone else's. To declare someone devoid of emotion is to strip them of humanity. This applies, however inhuman the consequences of their actions. Emotion is not the enemy of reason, although it can threaten reasoning. The tired and fashionable attitude that emotion needs to be dismissed as being a source of irrationality, error, and such deep frustration, leading to ugly dispute, is too shallow. Things are much more interesting. Emotion drives and is part of reason. Respect for its absolute necessity in order to reason to exist is long overdue. Pride, anger, lust, envy, greed, avarice, and sloth, the 7 deadly sins, along with many other emotions such as love, hatred, fear, sympathy, and hope, and so on, affect reason and influence the effects that reason can choose to create. This first paradox links emotion to reason, revealing a simple and long neglected, misunderstood, or simply ignored relationship. The implications are immense. Emotion cannot be analysed. Prince Charles remarked, "Whatever in love means," in the 1981 engagement interview to Diana. Then he rejoined with, "In love is open to your own interpretation, i.e., because it cannot be dissected, love is a Humpty Dumpty word. It means what you want it to mean." No, it doesn't. Emotions are non-logical. You can't analyse or dissect them to understand how they work, just like you can't find life by cutting up a living creature. Had he understood emotion is part of what we are, he might well have said something more sensitive. Which brings us to the second paradox of reason, and perhaps its most important consequence. Evidence of the necessity and existence of non-logic. And love is a non-logic word. The second paradox of reason reveals the importance and limited significance of logic. It hints at a freedom derived from necessity. In turn, this dictates how we manage to think. In other words, that there is freedom in determination. The long-held belief that determination is the opposite or enemy of freedom of thought appears to be incorrect. Like emotion is not the enemy of reason, so physical determination, cause and effect and so on, is not the enemy of freedom of thought. This paradox questions Aristotle through to Frege, Russell, Strawson, a heap of continental philosophies and all the rest. For many centuries, the Aristotelian view of causation held back scientific progress. Cause was thought to be innate. Then came Newton and others proposing, for instance, things fall to the ground not because they are heavy, but because gravity, an invisible force associated with mass, draws an object to the ground, and in a minuscule way, that object draws the earth towards it. Cause and effect, so explained, was a gigantic leap. Human understanding and the work of logic need a similar radical breakthrough. This reminds me of Alexander Pope's remark about Newton. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in sight. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. It is impossible to process all information and perceptions. For instance, we use special words such as movement to bridge inadequacies of perception. Zeno's paradox of the arrow is one example. Later echoes can be seen in the infinitesimals of calculus, a mathematical and algebraic system that enabled us to model movement using numbers. We can engage with movement and change because language gives us tools to do so. Where we cannot totally describe movement without ever splitting it into smaller and smaller parts, instead we just say it moved or something changed. The source and necessity of non-logical words springs from the second paradox. If you ask a computer to do too much, it will break down. In the old days, sometimes alarming messages might appear, such as fatal error on the blue screen of death. The usual solution was to restart the machine in the hope you could restore operation. Overwhelmed by demand, these machines threw their transistors up in the air and closed down. Although it's tempting to think our brains are organic computers, governed solely by on-off logic, the human spirit is vastly more sophisticated. The next few words are an aside. The second paradox not only explains why non-logic exists, but also hints at how the electronic logic of the brain creates and engages with the classical logic of speech, how the two different rules of exclusive and inclusive disjunction can exist without the brain becoming paralyzed by systemic contradiction. Getting back to the main point, the second paradox can be stated as follows. Given the vast amount of sensory perception and information humans receive, should we attempt to subject all to logical analysis, thinking would freeze. An organic version of the blue screen of death would be all that was left. Instead, we choose to subject only things that appear necessary for day-to-day living. All the rest that we remember, ideas, beliefs, prejudices, fantasies, hopes, fears, affections, dislikes, and so on, remain unexamined. They linger in memory, unmolested by logic, in the form of non-logic. To be reasonable, you have to be unreasonable. All thought, consciousness itself, depends on toleration of contradiction and inconsistency. Language has many non-logic words, including the emotions, movement, change, sensation, and so on. On the other hand, a word like tree can be analysed. What makes a tree? Wood, branches, bark, etc. Whereas words of the famous song, black is black, rather is to the contrary. You can't analyse that. But you can get different types of colour. But that's not analysis. We've already shown that movement cannot be totally described or analysed without appeal to movement words. Here's another aside for the philosophy buffs. Wittgenstein's picture theory and the ideas of logic-obsessed mid-20th century Western philosophers are desperately primitive and insult human sophistication. Picture theory of meaning states a proposition is a model or picture of reality. It maintains that the truth or falsity of a proposition can be evaluated through the picture or model it represents of a situation. None of the pompous apostles at Cambridge had the slightest idea that we are much more than logical creatures, and that we can only understand contradiction because of a non-logic that makes reasoning possible. Movement, another non-logic word, cannot be fully pictured. Anyone who's looked at railway sleepers from a moving train knows that a blur is not reality. Back to non-logic. Contradiction is the most important non-logic word of all. Non-logic and logic are partners in thinking. Language enables us to consciously grasp change and causality. It gives us freedom in determination. But the question of freedom of will is another matter. Albeit we can consciously plan before and after and can manipulate the physical world to make things that nature could not create itself in a billions of years. Mobile phones? Then again, because we come from or are part of nature, perhaps mobile phones are its creation, at one step removed. Because someone believes something does not detract from their humanity or the worth of art or other things that they create. Assuming we are logic machines, where one dodgy attitude or belief inevitably poisons all else, is borderline stupid. The notorious display of institutional pedantry exhibited by the Tate over its Whistler paintings, or the attitude of others towards Stanley Spencer's resurrection, should be seen for what they are: a pitiful, small-minded, logic-obsessed mentality reeking of intolerance and primitive views of the human spirit and the nature of humanity. Everyone has good and bad in them, and no one is a logic machine. The Tate was moved to declare Whistler racist on pathetic grounds. Spencer was convicted of racism for alleged portrayal of stereotypical images of non-white people, despite the latter, including people with other skin colours, in his work, portraying a last trump in an English country churchyard. The heart of democracy is respect for disagreement. As no one can conform to the extent such pedants demand, the sooner both paradoxes of reason are recognised and what they say is understood, the better. We have for too long tolerated simplistic views of how we think and engage with the physical and social world. We can escape the intellectual and political cage constructed by 20th century academic philosophers, and we desperately need to do so. In conclusion, the two paradoxes point to the error of making emotion the enemy of reason, and that contradiction is the enemy of logic. In the former, emotion is essential to reason. In the latter, logic could not be understood without understanding contradiction, the most important non-logic word. This does not turn philosophy upside down or invite chaos. Rather, logic and reason remain intact to be joined by equal respect for emotion and contradiction. The prospect of that coach and horses running through the arid, dead-end negativity of modern academic philosophy is really exciting. It is time it shone a light again. This is a radical, potentially dangerous enterprise, but pretending philosophy is irrelevant is more dangerous. Philosophy never went away. It was always important and utterly relevant to life and politics. In extreme, I would argue the ghastly carnage and senselessness of the Russia-Ukraine war stems directly from a failure in philosophy. Just to recap, the first paradox of reason leads to the idea that emotion drives and is part of reason. Without it, there would be no reason to reason. Yet emotion is intolerable in the process of reasoning. The second paradox notes, to avoid the collapse of reason, we must be unreasonable to reason. Emotion is part of who we are, and we are more or less than logical. One thing is certain, we are not solely logical. The human spirit deserves much more respect and humanity. Thank you for listening.